Hello and welcome to the Real Estate Marketing Minute. I'm your host, Adam Small, and with us today is Miss Kimberly Small.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well, thank you very much. And we have in the studio a special guest, Mr. Mark Ratterman. Hi, Mark.
Hi,
How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing just fine.
Great. So Mark is a certified appraiser here in Indiana, as well as the Indianapolis representative on the Appraisers Licensing Board. And today we're going to be talking all about appraisals today. So before we get started, Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into doing what you're doing now and a little bit about that.
Well, it goes back quite a few years. Back in 1978, I decided that real estate seemed interesting, and I tried after getting broker's license, I tried for about a year and a half to sell houses and found that I was not very good at it. And so being a little bit more analytical and less personable, I guess, I ended up moving into the appraisal business, which is, again, well suited to my personality. I started out when appraisers were only required to have broker's licenses at that point, and since I had one, I was already licensed to do that. I worked in the residential area for about 15, 20 years, and then started doing commercial work as well. And that's what I do today, as probably half of my business is residential and half of it is commercial. I spent about 15 years writing textbooks and teaching classes. And I can say I've taught classes in about 30 different states and about 7 or 8 different foreign countries. My textbooks have been converted or translated into 3 or 4 different languages. And so I am fairly well versed in appraisal techniques. And I currently sit on the Appraisal Institute's Body of Knowledge Committee, which is the committee that works on textbooks and decides what kind of policies and what procedures should be used for the Appraisal Institute, which is similar to what the National Association of Realtors is. I'm on the board of directors of the Indianapolis Board of Realtors. The Board of Realtors has a seat specified for appraisers. And so there's always one appraiser on the board of directors to make sure that any decision made at that level is well suited for and complements the appraisal industry, but is also to prevent appraisal issues from causing harm to the real estate business. And so as the Indianapolis representative of the licensing board, my job there is to administer over issuing new licenses, as well as, unfortunately, in some cases, having to sit in judgment of other appraisers who've had complaints filed against them. In our state, like the Real Estate Commission, complaints against appraisers are prosecuted by the Attorney General's office, and the decision maker is usually an administrative law judge, which is normally one of the Real Estate Appraiser Board members. Or in our case, all of them.
It's not a light thing to have that complaint against you then.
No, it's an excellent question. Most of the time, if a broker has a complaint filed against them, the public just doesn't really know, because the public doesn't usually research their complaints against real estate brokers. But in the appraisal business and residential, every lender checks the status of every appraiser on every job. And so consequently, if there's a complaint filed against them, it can impact their business significantly.
So that's a big thing. You want to be real careful with that.
Yes, and whereas anybody can file a complaint, we do have a screening process to make sure that frivolous complaints are not prosecuted against appraisers.
Well, that's good to hear, because sometimes people just get angry about things, right?
Well, yes, and most of our complaints are residential oriented, and a large portion of them are homeowners that are upset with the appraisals and
because it doesn't match what they want to sell for, basically.
Well, that or don't forget refinances.
Right.
Refinances are another issue because depending on what the interest rate climate is, maybe half the business is refinances.
Right.
And so if you can't get the mortgage you need to pay off the other one or to get to credit card debt covered, whatever.
Right.
It can cause people to be very irritated with their appraisers.
Right. So, kind of jumped ahead a little bit there. I was actually going to ask you, what are the minimum requirements to be an appraiser? You said when you first started, all you had to do is be a broker, and that was it. But
Right.
now apparently there's an entire licensing board and everything.
Well, you may remember back to what was called the savings and loan crisis back in the late 80s.
Right.
And at that time, the federal government passed a law called the Financial Institutions Reform and Recovery Enforcement Act, FIREA we call it. And
It's a mouthful, that's for sure.
It is. And it's still in force today. And the Dodd-Frank bill, which was passed in 2010, I think, also modified that law. And that is a law that essentially required appraisers to be licensed or certified.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, if they're doing work for federally related transactions, which is a very well-defined term. So essentially, an appraiser that is doing work for banks, savings and loans, and credit unions above a certain level must be a licensed or certified appraiser. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, and VA then also adopted the same criteria, saying that we will only use licensed and certified appraisers. So that's kind of where we're at today.
So that really drove it then. So
yeah, if you were an appraiser and you wanted to continue to do appraisals for a living, you had to become licensed or certified.
Right. So what are some of the common limitations that an appraiser must consider when doing an appraisal for lenders then?
As far as the lenders themselves have created a whole lot of rules. And of course, FHA and VA and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have their guidelines and rules as well. And so the most difficult part for a lot of appraisers is knowing what rules to follow and to make sure that they do. And so when a residential appraiser completes a report, many of them go to an intermediary called an appraisal management company. Appraisal management company then reviews them for compliance with the rules that they have been given by their client. And so in the case of FHA and VA, they're looking for, does the appraisal comply? For Fannie and Freddie, it's something slightly different. And so so complying with the rules is a big deal, and it causes appraisers to have to modify and edit their appraisals 1, 2, 3 times in many cases because some lender rule tells them that they got to do something they didn't do.
So when you say they have to edit it, do you mean necessarily changing the value of it, or change the wording, or to be more compliant?
Many times it's changed the comparables, and so they may say, well, this particular lender won't accept any appraisal if the comparables are older than a year, or this particular lender wants to see a discussion of this, or
so it's not necessarily changing the appraised value, I guess.
No,
it's
no,
just
not.
meeting the other
I would say that a few
requirements
times
around
it might be, but most of the time it's not a value question. It's the review appraiser that works for the appraisal management company or the underwriter might have said, "Look, there's an airport nearby. Did the appraiser comment on air traffic noise?"
Right.
And that's the kind of thing or the subject backs up to a busy street. Did they talk about that?
Okay.
And so they're looking to make sure that things should be considered were considered.
Understand.
So let's talk about some of the common questions that agents have when it comes to appraisals. You talked about comparables. Is an agent able to submit to an appraiser a list of comparables? And if not, how are those comparables determined, and how many are generally used in order to do an appraisal?
The answer to that question is pretty easy. And yes, the brokers are allowed, and I personally recommend that they do prepare a list of comparables that they'd like the appraiser to consider. The appraiser cannot rephrase. The broker cannot say they have to use those. They can only say, please consider these. The appraiser can then know, okay, let's look at what the broker gave me, and I'll look at what I've researched to come up with what a list of fair comparables would be. One of the funny things that we find to be true, and very few people disagree with me in this, is that if I run the BLC computer to find comparables and I get a long list of them, 2 hours later, I run the same thing and I get different answers. And it's not that the computer's wrong. It's somehow, some way, things are just slightly different and you get different answers. And for that reason, that's why I say it's a good idea for the brokers to submit some comparables, because they may found something that the appraiser didn't, because we do everything on computers now. And so I also recommend that the appraisers as well as the brokers look at Realist. And the reason for that is Realist is a thing that's on our BLC system, and it allows brokers and appraisers to find comparables in some cases that are not actually closed, or that are not published as closed sales. And the way this happens is that the broker sells the property, places it in as a pending, closes the deal, gets their check, closes the file, sticks it in the file folder, and never changes it from pending. Exactly. Never changes it from pending to closed. It expires and it's gone. Right. It's not a closed sale published, and nobody knows it closed, but actually it did. And there's one place you can find that, and that's in Realist, because Realist doesn't use the BLC data. It uses public record data. So the sales disclosure information now is published on a map. They put it on a map in the Realist. So you can actually find comparables that no one else will find.
Right, right.
So you mentioned BLC. Is that specific to Indianapolis? That's the MLS number, correct?
Yes.
And then the Realist, is that specific to Indianapolis as well? Or?
It's actually statewide, and I think I don't know how many different boards use it, but I think several boards in Indiana use it, so it's actually a good tool. Different states have different criteria and different ways of reporting sales. For example, I think Texas is a non-reporting state, so everything in Texas either comes through the MLS or you don't get it. In the case of Indianapolis, where we are a reporting state, so sale prices are actually reported to public record.
Okay. So in a hot market with low inventory, there's a lot of properties that get multiple bids, and sometimes the appraisal is not going to reflect that. What can an agent do if they have multiple bids and the appraisal is not coming in that align with that? Well,
sometimes the appraisers are able to find comparables that show how hot this market is, and they are a reflection of that. In many cases, if there's a spike in the market, yesterday's comparable sales are not going to be representative of today's sale prices by definition. If there's a spike and it jumps up 10%, in a month, it's very difficult to find comparables that support that. Which is not to say that it doesn't happen, just that it's much more difficult to find them. And so an appraiser can do two things, or a broker can do two things. They can prepare their client for, in this super hot market, we may not be able to get the appraisal may not come in this high, which is going to be a problem. And the second thing that they can do is that make sure that the appraiser has all the comparables that could possibly be used, and so they would be able to at least get to the as close to the prices they can. And so, but remember one thing: the appraiser's clients are the lenders, and since the job of the appraiser is to protect the client's interest, then essentially the client may not want them to stretch, may not want them to be exaggerating, and they won't. They do not want that, and so that's usually the problem. So that's why sometimes appraisals just don't make the price, because they can't. There's just no data to support that.
So, and you've mentioned it's a lender that is choosing the appraisal. Does an agent have any input in that?
No, they're not supposed to have any input on that. And that's something that the Dodd-Frank bill required. And it goes even farther back than that the lenders are supposed to choose their own appraisers. They're not even allowed to bring in appraisals and say, here, use this one. And they're not supposed to be part of the selection process. And so the lenders can order second appraisals if they're not happy with the first one, but they don't want to usually do that because it costs a lot of money to do that. So, the brokers can't, they're not allowed to say, don't use XYZ appraiser because I don't like him. And so I'm sure it happens, but they're not supposed to.
Okay. Are there certain property types that are more likely to have an appraisal problem?
in most cases, when they have appraisal problems, it's because the data is too good, not too bad. And what I mean by that is when the comparables are really bad, we have to make all kinds of adjustments and to compensate for the differences. It's when you've got a 4-bedroom, 2-story house in a suburb and you've got 9 comparables of pretty much the same house. There's no latitude. There's no the adjustment.
You really can't argue. When
there's no adjustment.
Data, right?
So they're selling for X dollars, and that's all there is to it. And so, but if you've got a log house on 27 acres in a rural area with a swimming pool in the backyard and a barn,
it's much more subjective.
It becomes more subjective, and therefore it becomes less of an appraisal problem because there's so much more subjectivity to it. Yeah. And so that's the problem. So the more likely where you have appraisals is when the data is just too good.
Okay. So what are some upgrades that generally don't show added value when it comes to appraisals? I know I've heard pools and finished basements sometimes don't come back as added value on an actual appraisal?
That's an excellent question. And I will say to you that up until a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had a criteria that essentially said that if you make excessively large adjustments, that those adjustments must be explained and supported. And lenders read that to mean that they wanted the appraisers not to make large adjustments. Well, the difficulty with that is, like here in Indiana, is if you've got a 2,000 square foot basement that's 2,000 square foot finished, and it costs, let's say, $25 to build it and $25 to finish the interior, that's a $100,000 asset. $100,000. So if it's a $500,000 house, you're making a $100,000 adjustment if the comparable doesn't have a basement. Well, lenders would hate that, and they would say, don't do that. So appraisers would, in many cases, underestimate the value of the basements because of the Fannie Mae Freddie Mac criteria. A year and a half ago, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac published a letter saying, we realize you're doing this and stop it, and we no longer require you to explain large adjustments like that. So the years of not adjusting much for basement hopefully are over. Because quite honestly, if you have a 2,000 square foot ranch house with a 2,000 square foot basement, the realtors all say that it's the same value. You should be considering it the same value. Well, we have some very strict rules that say that if any part of a floored area is below grade, we have to consider it basement. But that doesn't mean we have to consider it to be low cost space. Mm-hmm. So what I always tell people, I say, is if you say to me that the above grade's worth $75 finished, why wouldn't the lower level be $45, $50, $60 a square foot?
Right.
And so hopefully that's the issue. As far as pools and things like that, those depend a lot on two things. One, climate. I don't think a pool's worth as much in Minnesota as it is in Florida, just because you don't get to use it as much. And also the market segment that it sits in. And the reason I say that is because if you have a $200,000 house and a first-time home buyer is the most likely buyer, do they have extra cash and extra borrowing power available to them to buy recreational devices, things like a pool? The answer is probably not. They're getting 90% loans and they're having trouble with their down payments. But if you've got a $2.5 million house, how much excess cash do those people have to pay for pools? And the answer is quite a bit. And pools and tennis courts and extra recreational things that they will pay for. So I always tell appraisers, you have to know what your market is and your most likely buyer, and then you can decide whether that pool in the backyard is worth $30,000, $40,000, whatever it costs, or whether it's worth nothing. And so, because some cases there's just nobody to buy it because of the market segment that they're in.
We've talked a little bit about the value coming back and broker involvement and all that. What if the broker's not happy with the appraisal as it comes back? Can they argue that? Can they dispute it and push back, try to get it raised?
There's the Dodd-Frank bill, this is federal law now, specifically talks about not badgering an appraiser, not trying to coerce an appraiser, but then it follows up by saying this is not saying that an appraiser there shouldn't be some kind of an appeal process. And that's why almost all lenders will say the same thing, is the broker's not allowed to call the appraiser and badger them, or even submit comps to them after the fact, after the appraisal's done, but that they will accept any comparables that the agent feels or the homeowner feels are better comparables, and they just run them through the lender. And so the lender becomes kind of the buffer.
So they give it to the lender, and then the lender passes back to the appraiser, and then the appraiser says, well, yeah or no or whatever.
Exactly,
Okay.
correct. And that's when I like, a lot of times what happens is they send in comparables that the broker thinks is going to help their case, and a lot of times it doesn't. It hurts their case. And because once you put them on the grid and you look at them, you say, yeah, well, it's sold for more, but it's also got a 2,000 square foot finished basement that we don't have in the subject.
Right, or a massively upgraded something or other.
Yeah,
right?
so sometimes it doesn't help, sometimes it does. And I always look at that point, and the broker says, oh gosh, look, they didn't see the comparable down the street that just got published. Because sometimes, quite honestly, the comparable sales also are late getting into the books.
Right.
Or no books anymore, into the MLS system. So,
there you go. No longer any books. It's all computerized these days, right?
Yeah.
So if in the end, for one reason or another, the broker or the homeowner is upset, or I say home, it could be any property owner, right? If they're upset and they want to file a complaint, is there a process to do that? And what are some of the legitimate complaints versus the frivolous complaints that you mentioned earlier?
The process, it varies from state to state as far as, how the complaints are filed. In some cases, the complaints are public immediately and anybody can know about them. In my state, and here in Indiana, the complaints are confidential until they become published. And so once they've gone through the screening process, the appraisal complaints can then be processed and are public, but ours are confidential until then. Mm-hmm. But that may not be true in every state. As a matter of fact, a lot of states vary.
Okay, so the process is going to vary from state to state. And generally speaking, where would you go to find out what that process is? You said the Attorney General generally.
Yeah, in our state it's the Attorney General. It might be like in Kentucky, I think that you file the complaint with the Real Estate Appraisers Board. Mm-hmm. And in Illinois, I think it is the Office of Financial Services or something like Financial and Banking Services or something to that effect. Right. Ohio, it's the Department of Commerce or something like that. It varies from state to state, but they all have a process. They've required to have a process.
Okay, well, that's good. So what are some of the let's start off with the frivolous claims that you've heard, and then some of those that are legitimate.
Well,
without giving any specific names, of course.
Right, of course, and not that I could remember them anyway. And so, but the most common complaint is that the value is not high enough, and the appraiser's incompetent because he didn't get to the price that I sold it for, or I had 5 offers, and how could it not appraise out? And those.
So those are kind of frivolous then.
Well, if the appraiser used the best comparables that are possible and they didn't do anything irregular as far as adjustments, then they have to be considered frivolous complaints, because our process is not such that we can just say anything we want. We've got to provide support for a conclusion. And so if the appraiser's done all they can, then it has to be. We don't want to process a complaint against an appraiser because they did the best they could, and it just didn't get to the price. Then that made somebody mad, so they filed a complaint. Right.
Okay. So you've been working with agents for a long time now. A lot of times I hear it myself, just working with agents, they grumble about appraisals and inspections and stuff like that. So how can they prepare themselves and their clients for the process of the appraisal? Where can they find out about the rules and how they can make sure they're educated, and, even let their customer know, their client, the seller, know this is what's going to happen and this is how this works?
Well, as far as the agents learning, they probably should do what they can to take some CE classes that include some
focus on
appraisals and how these work, and they could even take the appraisal classes, but they're fairly expensive, so I don't think they'd want to. And but as far as educating their owners in that regard, mm-hmm. I think that the best thing they can do is just tell them that the bank or the lender, the client, the mortgage company, has hired somebody to come in and make sure that the value is in line with other market sales in the area. That's an appraisal. By law, an appraiser is a disinterested third party. For example, they can't be involved in the sale, and
They can't have any interest in it
they
at all,
cannot
right?
care
no
what it is.
financial or anything like that, right?
And every appraiser that does residential work using our standard form signs something that says, I swear I'm a disinterested, unbiased person.
Right.
And so that I can't have any interest in the deal.
So you can't do one for your friend down the road or anything like that.
Well, that's a very gray line. And the reason I say that is because if you're in Smallburg, Indiana, you know everybody in town, and so if you don't
gets
do
a
one,
little more difficult
it's more
there,
difficult to
right.
not do appraisals for friends because everybody's your friend,
Right.
Because you know everybody. But
Right.
if you're in a big city, urban area, yeah, you'd want to avoid things that you
Give
say
the appearance of it, right?
appearance of a conflict, or that you feel that you have a conflict, and so. Because again, the clients are relying on a disinterested third party to do these.
Right, and the client is actually the lender to reinforce that it's not the seller of the home, right?
Right.
So then the client's the one relying on that. So, is there anything that an agent can do when they're writing an offer? Anything that they should avoid? Anything that'll kind of help them along the way when they're writing their offers?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I'm glad you brought it up. Avoid things on offers that don't change the real estate, but do increase the price. Now, what I mean by that is, real estate is legally a legal term that defines what you're selling, and that means permanently affixed to the earth. So you got a building, and you put a light fixture in it, and it becomes real estate. But if you sell a house and you include a pontoon boat,
Mm-hmm.
the seller is saying, you ought to be paying $5,000 or $10,000, $20,000, whatever a pontoon boat costs, and saying, okay, so if you want my pontoon boat, the price isn't going to be $500,000; it's going to be $510,000. Well, guess what? The price just went up, but the real estate didn't change because
Right.
the pontoon is not real estate.
And that's going to affect the
Yeah.
appraisal, right?
And so the other more common thing is to get the seller to pay closing costs for the buyer, because that when you say to the seller, the buyer wants you to pay $10,000 in closing costs on their behalf, the seller then says, well, fine. Instead of $500,000, the price is $510,000. So you've just raised the price, but you didn't change the real estate.
Oh, okay.
And
Interesting.
so you're asking for appraisal problems because there's personal property in the deal or financing concessions in the deal. And so because the appraiser is probably only appraising the real estate. And the reason I say probably is because there are some property types where personal property is included.
Mhm.
Say hotels.
Okay.
You can't sell a hotel without furniture. So,
Right.
so what happens is there is personal property in hotel appraisals all the time. And lenders can loan on them. They just don't want to loan on them much.
Right. I understand. So, before we wrap up, Kim, do you have any other questions?
I don't think so. This has been very educational.
Yeah, very good. How about you, Mark? Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about these things, because communications between appraisers and brokers is sometimes not very friendly, but we try to make it as much as we can, and most of us have to work in the community for a long time.
Right. So it's generally a good idea to have good relationship, right?
It is, and I always say, just don't. If you're not happy with an appraiser, just wait a day before you do anything. And it's like,
Then you might be.
yeah, well, you may be, or you may say, well, I guess it isn't so bad. And so,
Right.
don't fire off letters and file complaints the day that you're mad, because, it's like.
Well, I think that's a golden rule in general.
Well,
Don't do anything when you're mad, right?
I have a 3-minute delay on my emails when they go out, just to prevent me from sending out something I wish I hadn't.
That's
So-
a man speaking from experience there. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mark. It was very informational and educational. We do appreciate it. This has been the Real Estate Marketing Minute. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what you're hearing, don't forget to like and/or subscribe. Have a great day.